welcome back to my channel. In this video I'm going to talk through what you need to start cross stitching, beginning with the essential items. So to start cross stitching you need your fabric to sew on. This is Aida fabric, which as you can see is divided into squares with holes in each corner. This is to make it easy to do your crosses and to help keep the size of the crosses consistent. Aida fabric comes with different size squares. They refer to it as a count. So this is 14 count Aida, which means that there are 14 squares per inch of fabric. This is quite a good size for beginners as well as more experienced stitchers. But you can get other sizes as well. So for instance, this piece is a 16 count, which means that there are 16 squares per inch of fabric. It's slightly harder to stitch on the smaller squares. It would also give you a smaller finished design if you were to do the same design on a 14 count and a 16 count. The larger the number of squares per inch of fabric, the smaller your finished design will be. You can also get an 18 count fabric, so this is 18 squares per inch. This is probably a little tricky if you're a beginner. Personally, I prefer to use 14 and 16 counts most of the time. Sometimes the pattern that you're using will tell you what size material to use in order to get a specific finished size. If the actual size of the finished stitch piece doesn't really matter, then it comes down to sort of personal preference as to what you want to use, what you feel comfortable using. But 14 count is probably a good place to start. You can also get your Aida material in different colours. So this is a 14 count in navy. The darker coloured materials are probably a little bit harder to stitch on, especially for beginners, as it can be a little bit harder to see the holes sometimes. So a beginner might want to stick to lighter colours, whites, creams, and even a light blue or a lilac if you want to add a bit of colour. You can also get material, your Aida material, in a printed style, like these two, which can add a bit of variety to your background without you having to stitch all the background. These pieces are actually 11 count. So there's 11 squares per inch. So a design on here would come out larger than if you did it on a 14 count piece of Aida. You can also stitch on other types of material. I think as long as there's the squares to help you do your crosses, it makes it much easier, especially to keep the consistency of the size of your stitches. So there's like even weave or linen fabrics can quite often be used, but you can also get a dissolvable Aida fabric. So if you wanted to stitch a cross stitch design on, say, a t-shirt that hasn't got the squares on there, you could put on a piece of the soluble Aida material to do your cross stitch design, and then the Aida can be dissolved afterwards, so you're just left with the material of the t-shirt behind your design after that. The next thing you need for your cross stitching is some thread. Sometimes it's also known as floss. The most commonly used threads in cross stitching is stranded cotton, which usually come in a bundle like these. These ones are by DMC, which is one of the most commonly used threads in cross stitching, along with Anchor is another one that's quite commonly used. As you can see, each bundle of floss has a number on it. This is to help you know which colours you need for the design that you're stitching. If you don't want to use the brand that's given in a pattern, you can use converters, which can help you match up the colours to other brands, or you can just pick out the colours you want to use. Stranded cotton is made up of 6 strands. Usually when you're stitching, you don't use all 6 strands at the same time, but the chart that you're using will usually tell you how many strands you need for the different stitches that you need to do. Quite often the actual crosses are done using 2 strands, back stitching using 1 strand, but there can be a variation, so you're best off checking your chart as for what's required. I store my threads on card bobbins like this, just because I find it much easier, and then I can pop them into a storage box like so, all together. Just helps to keep them clean and tidy, and if you keep them in order, in your number order, they're easy to find when you want a specific colour. It's just a lot neater this way. It doesn't really matter, people have different ways of storing them. This is just my preferred method. Once you've sorted your material and threads, you then need a needle to start stitching. In cross stitch we use a tapestry needle, which has a slightly blunter end than a normal sewing needle. This is to help prevent any accidental piercing of the threads of the fabric or splitting of the floss that you are stitching with. They also have a larger eye than standard sewing needles, which makes them much easier to thread, and also helps to protect the threads you're stitching with from wear and tear. The needles can come in different sizes, and the size that you want to use partly depends on personal preference, but can also be determined by the size or the count of the Aida fabric you are using. So this is a size 24 needle, which is absolutely perfect for 14 count Aida. I tend to use these on my 16 count Aida as well, although a size 26 needle is actually recommended for the 16 count. You can also get them slightly bigger. So this one is a size 22 needle, which is perfect for stitching on 11 count Aida, but you probably wouldn't want to use this on a 14 or especially a 16 count, as being thicker, it might just stretch the holes in the Aida fabric and might finish off distorting your finished design, not making it look quite so good. If you are stitching on a smaller count of fabric, so say a 18 count Aida, then you might need a much thinner needle like this one, which is a size 28. This is perfect on those smaller counts, but if you were stitching on a larger count, you probably wouldn't want to use one quite this thin, as they do tend to bend a bit more and they break a little bit more easier than the larger size 24 needles. Okay, but like I said, the needle you use is partly personal preference and partly determined by the size of the fabric you are using. Another important tool for cross stitching are your scissors. This is the pair that I use for cutting both my fabric and my threads. These work absolutely fine for me. Some people might prefer a smaller scissor for cutting their threads. So something like these. You can get ones that are really, really fancy, but just a simple pair like this, absolutely fine. You can also get little tools like these. I call them little snippers, which you can cut your threads quite close to the material with these. Again, absolutely perfect. One of my big rules when it comes to cross stitching, which I don't have many, but probably the biggest one I have, is that my scissors for cross stitching are for cross stitching only. Everybody who knows me knows you do not touch my cross stitching scissors because I will go ballistic. If you cut card, paper with your cross stitching scissors, you will find it will blunt the scissors over time, and then you won't get such a clean cut on your fabric and on your threads, and it just makes things a little bit untidy for me. So yeah, just don't do it. Keep them just for your cross stitching. For me, my last essential when I'm cross stitching is my chart. You can get designs printed onto the Aida fabric to follow, but I prefer to do counted cross stitch, so my Aida fabric is blank, and I use this chart to show me what stitches I need to put where. In later videos, I will go into more detail about how to read the chart, how to understand what the different shapes, symbols, etc. mean, as far as which stitches you need to be doing for these squares. But essentially your chart shows you what colours you need to be using where in your design. I always supply a colour chart and a black and white one. I also supply them without the back stitching as well as with. This is purely because sometimes when you've got a back stitching line going through a square, it can just make it a little bit harder to read what symbol is there to determine what colour you need to use. Again, I will cover this more in a later video. But essentially, each symbol on the chart, so say for example the H, if you look on the key, it will tell you what colour H is, so it's DMC 726 that you would need to use in those squares. The keys also tell you how many strands of the thread you need to use for each type of stitch, and also how many skeins, which is like the bundles of thread, and the name for the bundles of threads, how many of those that you need. So with this one, you need less than a skein for each of the colours in it. I personally prefer to use my colour block ones, as I just find it easier to distinguish the different types of stitching I need to use. But it can be a personal preference. Some charts only come in black and white, some might only come in colour. As long as you can read them to get the design onto the Aida material, it is really a personal preference thing. I've now got a few optional extras that I'm going to share with you. Some of them are things that I like to use when I'm cross stitching, just to try and make my life a little bit easier. Some of the things are things that maybe other people use. The first of the optional extras is actually one that I don't use myself. It's an embroidery hoop. These come in 2 parts, like so. You pop your fabric between them, pop them back together and screw it in. Some people like to use these to help keep the tension of the fabric even when they're stitching. You can also get frames that do the same sort of thing. Both need to be removed when you're not stitching so that you don't damage your material. Personally, I tend to just hold my fabric in my hand when I'm stitching. If I am using a larger piece of fabric, such as this one, then I will just roll over the edges in the unused area and then use a giant paper clip just to secure it in place, like so. I'll pop one each end, and then the other end where I'm stitching from, I will roll in and I will hold. Sometimes I will paper clip that end as well, just to help, but I find that suits me just fine. The next optional extra is something that I sometimes use and I sometimes don't. Masking tape. I use masking tape to prevent the edges of the material from fraying, particularly when I'm working on large pieces. If I'm only doing a small piece, I probably won't bother. But something, say, up to this, from this sort of size, then I just edge the material with some masking tape before I start stitching, just to stop it from fraying. You could also stitch the edges if you want to stop the fraying, or even use like pinking shears, you know, the zigzag scissors, when you're cutting it, to stop them from fraying as well. But for me, if I want to stop my edges fraying, just a bit of standard masking tape stuck around the outside is fine. It can be quickly removed once you've finished your piece without damaging the material at all. My next optional extra might be a little bit of an odd one, but it's my little box for putting my offcuts of thread in. When I started cross stitching, the one thing that used to get a bit annoying was that when you've cut off the ends of your threads, you roll them into a ball, you put them in a pile, intending on putting them in the bin when you're finished. They end up on the floor, they end up stuck to you, end up on your chair. They don't always end up in the bin, or at least that's what I found. Yes, you can put a bin next to you when you're cross stitching, but if you're cross stitching when you're out and about, there might not be a bin available. There might be other people wanting that bin for other things. So it's not as practical. This is where my little box came in. It's just a little plastic box that clicks shut, goes in the bag with all your cross stitching, so it can be taken anywhere with you. And as you finish with each bit of thread, if it's not big enough to use again, then you can just pop it in the box, and then when your box gets full, drop it all in the bin. Job done. No bits of thread everywhere. The next optional extra is for those that find it a little bit tricky to thread their needle. A needle threader. A couple of different sorts here. Essentially, they both work the same though. You literally pop this little piece here through the eye of the needle, pop your thread into it, put it back through. And again, with this, just pop it through, thread in, pull it back, you've threaded your needle. I don't tend to use them. I tend to have found other ways of threading my needle without having to use them, but they're a good option for anybody who does struggle with getting the thread through that eye of the needle. Right. My next optional extra, a pencil. Can be any pencil, could be a pen. Literally, it's just for marking off a chart as you go along. You might not find you'll always need to do that. With me, it depends on how complicated the chart is. If there's a lot of small areas in one colour, or like confetti stitches, then it's sometimes easier if you can mark them off as you go. But it's not absolutely necessary. I'd advise using pencil so that you can erase it if you end up having to undo a stitch, because you can still go wrong even with marking it off. And also I would advise that it might be better to take a copy of your chart just in case of any problems, so you've still got that clean copy if you would need it later on. Other options for if you want to mark your chart off, a good one is to take a photo of your chart, like on a tablet, and then use like a markup function on there to mark off as you go. And there are also apps available where you can download digital copies of charts, and they can be marked as you go along, just so you know where you've got to. The last of my optional extras is my magnetic board. This was actually bought for me to use in my paper crafting, but I've actually ended up using it more for my cross stitching. I just take the little magnets off, pop my chart on, just magnetise it down so it doesn't move, and then you've got the ruler that comes with it, little magnetic ruler, so you can put that across so that you can keep track of which row you're working on and move it down as you go. There are alternative options to this of any magnetic board really, with a magnetic ruler across would work just as well. Just helps me when I'm working on maybe a larger design and I don't want to mark it off as I go. It's not that complicated, but I just need to keep track of what line I'm on so that I don't have to keep counting every time I look back at my pattern to find where I am again. And that's everything you need. I'll put some links below of places where you can buy some of the things I've gone through today. And if you've got any questions, pop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. In my next video, I am going to show you how to actually get going on your cross stitch project. Thank you for watching. Bye.